Vladimir Putin was certain the fortress would hold. For 3 years, his war economy had absorbed every sanction the West could throw at it, and the walls never cracked. Western capitals predicted collapse within months. It never came. So when his own finance ministry handed him a memo this month warning that the war in Ukraine had reached an unaffordable path, Putin did the one thing no commander expects from the people guarding his treasury. He overruled them. He told them to keep the military spending exactly where it was and to find the savings somewhere else. According to Bloomberg, which reviewed the internal documents, this was the most serious sign of division inside Moscow since the full-scale invasion began. And here is the part that should keep the Kremlin awake at night. The deadliest threat to Putin's fortress is no longer a missile fired from Kyiv. It is the arithmetic written in his own ledger. The numbers that built the war are now turning against the man who started it. So let us see how the wall finally began to crack, not from the outside, but from within. To understand why this memo matters so much, you first have to understand how formidable the thing it threatens really is. Because for 3 years, the world watched Russia do something almost no one believed was possible. In 2022, when the tanks rolled into Ukraine, the West unleashed the largest sanctions campaign in modern history. Economists predicted the ruble would turn to rubble, that the Russian economy would contract by double digits, that the fortress would fall in a single winter. Instead, Moscow adapted. It rerouted its oil away from Europe and toward India and China. It built a shadow fleet of aging tankers to keep the crude flowing past Western restrictions. It poured money into its military-industrial complex, and that machine roared to life. Defense spending grew by roughly 30% in recent years, funding a massive expansion in weapons production. Entire cities, entire industries were rebuilt around the war. By the time the 2026 budget was drafted, Russia had set aside nearly 17 trillion rubles for defense and security, a figure of around 238 billion US dollars. That single line now consumes close to 40% of all government spending. Think about that for a moment. Almost half of everything the Russian state spends now flows toward the war and the apparatus that sustains it. This was the fortress Putin built, and from the outside, it looked impregnable. The central bank, run by some of the most respected technocrats in the country, held the line on inflation. The National Wealth Fund, Russia's sovereign rainy day reserve, stood ready as the war chest. Oil and gas money flowed in like an artery feeding a giant. Putin's entire strategy rested on a single bet that this fortress economy could simply outlast the West's patience, that Europe and America would tire of the war long before Russia ran out of money. For 3 years, that bet looked like it was paying off, and that is exactly why what happened next is so significant. Because this month, the walls of that fortress did not crack from a missile or a sanction or a battlefield defeat. They cracked from the inside, and the blow did not come from Kyiv. It came from Putin's own accountants. Let us start with the memo itself. According to Bloomberg, senior officials in Russia's finance ministry and central bank warned the Kremlin that the current level of defense spending risks pushing the budget deficit to dangerous levels. These were not outsiders, and they were not critics. These were the very people responsible for keeping the fortress solvent, and they had grown increasingly alarmed by the state of the economy. Their recommendation was blunt: cut military spending. Putin's answer was just as blunt. No, he instructed the finance ministry to find savings everywhere else in the budget and to leave defense untouched. So what exactly did those officials see in the numbers that frightened them so badly? Start with the deficit. In just the first 4 months of 2026, Russia's federal budget gap reached roughly 5.9 trillion rubles. In dollar terms, depending on the exchange rate you use, that is somewhere between 82 and 93 billion. Either way, it is already the widest deficit since the full-scale war began. And here is the detail that turns a bad number into an alarming one. When Russia drafted its 2026 budget, it planned for a deficit of around 3.8 trillion rubles for the entire year. In other words, just 4 months in Moscow had already blown past its annual target by roughly 50%. The whole was supposed to last 12 months. It opened in 4. However, a deficit is only half the story. A deficit is simply what happens when you spend more than you earn. And the problem for Putin is that the earning side is failing too. The fortress is not just spending more, it is making less. According to Medusa, citing Bloomberg's reporting, Russia's economy ministry has slashed its forecast for economic growth in 2026 down to just 0.4% cut from an earlier projection of 1.3. And in the first quarter of this year, the Russian economy actually contracted its first quarterly decline in 3 years. Let that sink in. An economy that is shrinking is being asked to fund a war that keeps getting more expensive. How long can that possibly last? Furthermore, the cushion that was supposed to absorb shocks like this is wearing dangerously thin. Russia's national wealth fund, the reserve Putin built up during the years of high oil prices, is now reportedly around 60% smaller than it was before the full-scale invasion. The war chest is finite, and it is draining. The finance minister Anton Siluanov said the quiet part out loud. Speaking to a Russian business newspaper in late May, he urged restraint in public spending and warned that reserves are not infinite. From the man who holds the keys to the treasury, that is not a routine comment. That is a flare fired into the night sky. And there is a deeper reason the spending keeps climbing, a reason no simple budget cut can ever reach. The war is quietly devouring the one resource every economy depends on, even more than oil or money. It is devouring people. To keep the fight going in Ukraine, Russia has pulled roughly 1 million working-age men into the military, while successive waves of emigration have driven hundreds of thousands more out of the country entirely. According to one detailed analysis, the war and the exodus together have stripped well over 2% of the civilian workforce out of the economy. And then the defense industry, lavishly funded by the state, swallowed whatever was left, bidding workers away from ordinary factories with wages those factories could never hope to match. The army needs men to fight. The weapons plants need men to arm them. And the civilian economy is left fighting over the scraps. The result is a labor shortage so severe that the central bank itself has warned it will drag on the economy for years. By the end of 2024, Russian companies were already short around 2.2 million workers, with nearly 70% of firms reporting they simply could not find the people they needed. And the manufacturing sector alone was missing close to 2 million hands. Now, Putin loves to boast about Russia's unemployment rate, which at just over 2% is among the lowest in the entire world. But as Bloomberg points out, that number is not a sign of strength at all. It is a sign of a labor market with nothing left to give a fortress that has run out of hands to man its own walls. So how does Putin keep the men flowing to the front without ordering another deeply unpopular mobilization like the one that shook the country in 2022? The answer is simple. He pays, and the sums are staggering. By March of 2026, the average sign-on bonus for a single new contract soldier had climbed to roughly 1.5 million rubles, with regions across the country raising their offers again and again. At one point, last year, Russia was reportedly spending around 2 billion rubles every single day, more than $20 million, just on these enlistment bonuses. And here is the detail that captures the sheer absurdity of it. The Russian military is now offering pay and bonuses so high that, according to Bloomberg, it has begun to outbid the country's own oil and gas sector, the very industry whose revenue is supposed to fill the war chest in the first place. The war is now competing for workers against the engine that funds it. And even with all of that money on the table, it is no longer enough. Recruitment in the first quarter of 2026 fell by around 20% compared to a year earlier, even as the bonuses kept climbing. Now follow the chain because this is where the trap begins to tighten on itself. Too much money chasing far too few workers does what it has always done throughout history. It sets inflation alight. Wages have been climbing faster than the economy can actually produce, and prices have chased them upward. To stop that fire from spreading out of control, Russia's central bank was forced back in late 2024 to raise its key interest rate to 21%, the highest level the country had seen in 2 decades. And even after a long series of cuts brought it down to 14.5% by April of 2026, borrowing money inside Russia remains brutally expensive, while underlying inflation still runs well above the bank's own target. A growing chorus of Russian business leaders has warned of what they call a perfect storm, in which punishing interest rates and an overvalued ruble together choke off investment and smother growth for years to come. And here lies the cruelest irony of the fortress economy. To fund the war, Putin overheats the economy. To cool the economy, his own central bank strangles every business that does not live off a defense contract. The disease and the cure are now the same war, and there is no dose that treats the one without deepening the other. But now we arrive at the heart of the matter, the artery that explains everything. Why is the fortress bleeding money so fast? The answer is oil. Oil and gas revenue funds nearly a quarter of the entire Russian state budget. It is the single most important lifeline keeping the war machine alive. And right now, that lifeline is being severed not by sanctions and not by diplomacy, but by drones. Over the past 2 years, Ukraine has waged a relentless campaign of long-range drone strikes against Russia's oil refineries, depots, and export terminals. This is no longer a sideshow. According to independent analysts tracking the strikes, Ukrainian forces have now hit 24 of Russia's 33 major refineries, knocking out roughly a quarter of the country's fuel production and as much as a third of its refining capacity. And in May of 2026, the campaign reached a new intensity. Ukrainian drones struck more than 10 major facilities in a single month, hitting refineries in Moscow, Ryazan-Perm, Kiryshi-Tuapse-Primorsk, and Yaroslavl. On the night of May 15th, a swarm of nearly 100 drones slammed into the Ryazan refinery, one of the largest in central Russia. The fires were so intense that an oily black rain fell over the city, and local authorities declared a state of emergency. 2 days later, drones reached the Moscow refinery itself, a facility tied to a critical pipeline hub that pumps Siberian oil toward the Baltic export port of Primorsk. The damage there limited Russia's ability to reroute its oil flows around terminals that earlier strikes had already crippled. In other words, these strikes are not random. They are systematically cutting the veins that carry Russia's oil to the world, and the consequences are already showing. Russia has now banned the export of gasoline in force since the 1st of April and banned jet fuel exports through the end of November, all to protect dwindling domestic supplies. Even Russian officials have stopped pretending. Speaking at an economic forum, Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak admitted that the country's oil production is now lower than it was at the start of 2026, blaming what he called unscheduled repairs at refineries. That is about as close to an admission of damage as the Kremlin ever offers. And a fellow at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, Sergei Vakulenko, told Bloomberg that the Ukrainian strikes appear to have disabled most of the spare refining capacity Russia traditionally kept in reserve. If much more is lost, he warned the risk of a genuine fuel shortage rises sharply. On the other hand, you might think rising global oil prices would ride to Putin's rescue. After all, conflict in the Middle East has pushed prices higher. But here, too, the fortress finds no relief. According to people close to the Russian government, oil would need to stay above $100 a barrel for at least a year to make a meaningful difference. And meanwhile, a strong ruble is actually eating into the value of Russia's export earnings. The one lever Putin always trusted, high oil prices bailing out the budget, is jammed. And then, as if the pressure from within were not enough, the noose is tightening from the outside as well. The European Union is preparing a new wave of sanctions aimed squarely at the machinery that keeps Russia's war funded. According to Politico, Brussels is set to target 4 Chinese companies accused of supplying drone components, military-related chemicals, and support for Russia's shadow fleet, with EU foreign ministers expected to take up the measures within days. Beyond that, a far larger package is being prepared for later this summer, one that could strike at Russia's oil giants, Lukoil and Rosneft, and expand the list of sanctioned shadow fleet tankers even further. So the same artery, the oil money, is being squeezed from inside by Ukrainian drones and from outside by Western sanctions at the very same time. Now, place yourself in Putin's chair, and you can see the trap closing. His deficit is exploding. His economy is shrinking. His reserves are draining. His oil lifeline is being cut. And his own finance ministry is begging him to ease off the war. Yet the defense ministry is doing the opposite. It is not just resisting cuts. It is demanding more, asking for as much as 3 trillion additional rubles this year. And the argument the hawks make is revealing. They warn that cutting defense would itself damage the economy because so many Russian businesses now depend on military contracts. The fortress has become a machine that must keep feeding itself or starve. That is the division Bloomberg exposed. On one side, the technocrats who read the balance sheet. On the other, the security bloc that reads only the map. And in the middle sits one man who acts as the final arbiter on every major budget decision. Putin chose the war. So where does this road lead? Picture the choice now narrowing in front of the Kremlin like a corridor with the walls closing in. If the reserves keep draining and oil cannot refill them, Putin is left with only painful options. He can keep cutting everywhere else, slashing pensions, social programs, and civilian spending, and ask ordinary Russians to pay for the war chest with their living standards. Or he can print money and risk the kind of inflation that hollows out an economy from within. Neither path is sustainable, and both carry political danger. According to Nigel Gould-Davies of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the Kremlin is now facing a stark choice between escalating its demands on the economy or scaling back the very aims of its war. And the Financial Times has cautioned as a warning rather than a certainty that battlefield setbacks, combined with this financial strain, could deepen the fractures among Russia's elite and in time threaten Putin's own grip on power. History offers a sobering parallel, and it is one Russia knows from more than a single century. In 1917, a war the imperial treasury could no longer afford helped bring down an empire from within before a single foreign army reached the capital. And the Soviet Union decades later was not defeated by NATO tanks rolling across a border either. It collapsed in part when a sharp fall in global oil prices collided with a military burden the economy could no longer carry. By the late 1980s, Moscow was spending itself into a corner. By 1991, the Union was gone. Empires rarely fall in a single dramatic battle. More often, they bleed out slowly through a wound in the treasury until one day the money simply runs out. The pattern does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes. And consider the brutal arithmetic at the center of all this. A Ukrainian drone costing only a few $1,000s and flown hundreds of kilometers into Russian territory can take a refinery worth hundreds of millions offline for months, sometimes longer, because Western sanctions block Russia from buying the specialized parts needed to repair it. In this war, more and more, the cheap weapon is defeating the expensive target. And the most expensive target of all may turn out to be Putin's own budget. Which brings us to the question worth sitting with. When the savings everywhere else finally run dry and the reserves are gone and the oil money keeps shrinking, who in Moscow blinks first? The men who read the balance sheet or the man who refuses to read it? For 3 years, Putin bet that his fortress could outlast the West. But he may have forgotten the oldest rule of every fortress ever built. It is rarely the wall that falls first. It is the well that runs dry inside it. What do you think? Will Russia's economy force Putin toward the negotiating table, or will he double down no matter the cost? Share your thoughts in the comments below because we read them and the debate down there is often as sharp as the analysis up here. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what is really happening inside Russia, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you do not miss what comes next as this story develops. And if you would rather listen than watch, you can find this and our other deep dives on Spotify, perfect for long drives or long journeys when you want to think through the bigger picture. The memo has been written, the clock is ticking, and somewhere in Moscow, the men who count the money are waiting to see whether anyone is finally willing to listen.